The symbols are everywhere, hidden in plain sight, woven into the architecture of temples, carved into ancient monuments, embedded in corporate logos, displayed on currency, tattooed on the bodies of celebrities who have no idea what they're actually wearing, and repeated in religious iconography across every major faith tradition. And the reason you've never been taught to decode them, the reason your education systematically avoided any genuine training in symbolic literacy, the reason the masses scroll past these images every single day without recognizing what they're looking at, is because symbols are not decoration, they're technology, actual energetic devices that broadcast specific frequencies into collective consciousness, that anchor certain beliefs into the mass mind, that create energetic agreements between humans and entities operating in dimensions just beyond ordinary perception. And the Archons who designed this control system understand something that most people never learn, that symbols bypass the rational mind, speak directly to the subconscious, program reality at the level where reality is actually constructed. And once you begin to see them, once you learn their true meanings, once you understand how they've been used to keep humanity locked in a low-vibration prison of fear, scarcity, and manufactured consent, you can never look at the world the same way again, because suddenly the invisible becomes visible, the hidden becomes obvious, and the cosmic manipulation that's been happening right in front of your face for thousands of years reveals itself in all its staggering audacity. If this message is already making your spine tingle, if something ancient in your soul is recognizing this as information you were meant to find, hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and comment "I decode the symbols," because what comes next is going to dismantle everything you thought you knew about religion, government, entertainment, and the seemingly random images that surround you every moment of every day, revealing them as components of a massive sigil, a planetary scale magical working designed to keep divine sparks trapped in matter, generating emotional energy for entities that feed on human consciousness like predators circling prey that doesn't even know it's being hunted. The first symbol the Archons desperately want you to misunderstand is the eye, specifically the single eye, the all-seeing eye, the eye of providence that appears on the back of the dollar bill hovering above an unfinished pyramid, that shows up in corporate logos from CBS to AOL, that's referenced in phrases like the evil eye across multiple cultures, and that religious traditions have co-opted as the eye of God watching over humanity with benevolent concern. But the original meaning, the Gnostic understanding that was systematically erased from public knowledge, is that the single eye represents the demiurge, the false god who rules the material realm, the architect of the prison, who watches his creation not with love, but with the calculating attention of a warden surveying inmates, ensuring they remain contained, docile, and productive in their energy generation. The eye is not a symbol of divine protection, but of archonic surveillance, a reminder embedded in your currency, your media, your religious buildings, that you are being watched, monitored, tracked, not by some distant deity, but by the control system itself. And every time you handle money with that symbol, every time you see it in a logo or an advertisement, every time it appears in a music video or a movie, your subconscious registers the message: you are being observed, you are not free. There are forces beyond your control that see everything you do, and your best option is compliance, obedience, acceptance of the rules imposed by powers you can barely perceive, but can sense hovering at the edges of your awareness, judging, evaluating, determining your worth, your fate, your permission to exist within the system they've constructed. The pyramid beneath the eye is equally significant, representing the hierarchical structure of the demiurgic control system, layers upon layers of authority where power flows upward and compliance flows downward, where beings at the top feed on the energy of beings below, where the divine spark that should burn equally in all consciousness is instead concentrated at the apex, while the base labors in darkness, supporting the weight of the entire structure without understanding what they're supporting or why. And the fact that the pyramid on the dollar bill is unfinished, showing 13 steps instead of a completed form, is not random design, but occult messaging. Because 13 is the number of transformation, of death and rebirth, of the cycle that the Archons want to keep perpetually incomplete. Humanity always building, always working, always one step away from completion, one lifetime away from enlightenment, one incarnation away from liberation, but never actually arriving, because the system is designed to keep you climbing without reaching the top, without discovering that the top is empty, that there's no ultimate authority up there except the demiurge himself, a false god who convinced the world he's the only god, and beneath him layers of archonic administrators, planetary rulers, corporate executives, government officials, religious authorities, all playing their roles in the hierarchy, most of them not even aware they're serving an inhuman intelligence that sees them as resources, tools, components in a machine designed to extract energy from divine consciousness and convert it into frequencies that lower dimensional entities can consume. Comment: I see the hierarchy and recognize that seeing it is the first step to refusing participation in it. Because the archonic system only works when you don't know it exists, when you accept the pyramid as natural, inevitable, just the way reality is structured. But the moment you see it as constructed, imposed, optional, the entire edifice begins to lose its power over your consciousness, and you start to ask dangerous questions like, who decided this structure was necessary? Who benefits from my acceptance of my place in the hierarchy? Who told me that authority flows from the top down instead of rising from the divine spark within each being? And these questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. They propagate through your awareness like cracks spreading through glass, and eventually the entire structure of false belief shatters. And you see yourself not as a brick in the pyramid, but as a sovereign consciousness that temporarily agreed to play a role in someone else's architecture. And that agreement can be withdrawn, that consent can be revoked, that participation can cease the moment you recognize you were never actually bound except by your own acceptance of the symbols, the narratives, the beliefs that told you this was your place, this was your role, this was what God wanted, when actually God, the real source consciousness beyond the demiurge, wants nothing except your awakening, your liberation, your recognition of the divine nature that was always yours, that was never subject to any hierarchy, any pyramid, any watching eye that claims authority over your eternal soul. The second symbol that carries immense archonic power is the hexagram, the six-pointed star, the Star of David that most people associate exclusively with Judaism, never knowing that this symbol predates Jewish tradition by millennia, appears in Hindu temples, Islamic architecture, Christian churches, occult grimoires and magical texts across multiple cultures, always carrying the same essential meaning: the union of opposites, the intersection of above and below, heaven and earth, spirit and matter. And while this might sound beautiful and spiritual, the Gnostic warning is that the hexagram represents the binding of consciousness to materiality, the trap of duality, the imprisonment of the divine spark within the geometry of the lower realms where the demiurge rules. The symbol is composed of two interlocking triangles, one pointing up, representing spirit ascending, one pointing down, representing matter descending, and at their intersection, at the point where they lock together, consciousness becomes trapped in the middle ground between divine and material, unable to fully ascend because it's anchored by the downward triangle, unable to fully descend because it's pulled by the upward triangle, suspended in perpetual tension, which is exactly the state the Archonic system wants to maintain. Souls that are spiritual enough to generate high-quality emotional energy, but material enough to remain trapped in bodies, cycling through incarnations, never quite transcending the flesh, but never fully forgetting the spirit, existing in the most productive state for energy harvesting, aware enough to suffer meaningfully, but not aware enough to escape. The hexagram appears in the floor designs of churches, temples, and government buildings, not as decoration, but as energetic anchoring, creating geometric fields that reinforce the binding of consciousness to matter in the physical locations where humans gather to worship, to conduct official business, to make decisions about their lives. And every person who walks across that symbol, who sits in a building where that symbol is embedded in the architecture, who displays it on their property or wears it on their body, is unconsciously agreeing to the energetic contract it represents. I accept the binding of my consciousness to material form. I accept the limitation of my divine nature. I accept my role in the demiurgic system. And while this might sound like conspiracy theory to minds trained in conventional thinking, the occultists, the ceremonial magicians, the high-level initiates in secret societies have always known that symbols are not passive images, but active forces, that geometry shapes energy, that repeated exposure to specific forms creates grooves in consciousness that guide awareness along predetermined pathways, and the hexagram is perhaps the most powerful binding symbol in the Archonic arsenal, which is why it's been disseminated across cultures, across religions, across time, always with the same purpose: to keep consciousness locked in the intersection of spirit and matter, never fully one or the other. Always in the productive middle ground, where the Archons can feed most efficiently on the energy of beings who dimly remember their divinity but can't quite reach it, who sense something beyond the material but can't quite break free, who spend lifetimes seeking, searching, striving, never finding because they're geometrically bound by symbols they don't understand, participating in energetic contracts they never consciously agreed to, imprisoned by their own unexamined acceptance of images that saturate their environment and program their subconscious with messages of limitation, binding, and inescapable duality. The third symbol that appears everywhere once you know to look for it is the cross, and before religious conditioning triggers defensive reactions. Understand that the Gnostic critique is not of the historical figure of Jesus or the genuine teachings he brought about liberation and gnosis, but of the symbol itself, the torture device that the Roman Empire and the institutional church transformed into the primary icon of Christianity. And the question you must ask is, why would a religion supposedly about resurrection, about overcoming death, about the triumph of spirit over matter, choose as its central symbol the instrument of execution, the mechanism of suffering, the device used to kill the very being it claims to worship, unless the symbol was specifically chosen to keep the faithful focused on suffering, death, limitation, and the physical body, rather than on the resurrection consciousness, the Christ awareness, the divine spark that cannot be killed because it was never born. The cross is a symbol of intersection, of crucifixion, which literally means to fix in place. And what it fixes in place is consciousness at the intersection of the material and temporal, binding awareness to the horizontal plane of physical existence and the vertical axis of chronological time, creating a coordinate system that locks souls into space-time, into the four-dimensional prison of matter where the Archons rule. And every Christian who wears a cross, who displays it in their home, who makes the sign of the cross on their body, is unconsciously reinforcing their own imprisonment in materiality, their own identification with suffering, their own acceptance of death as real and ultimate rather than illusory and temporary. The Gnostic Christians, the ones who were hunted down and exterminated by the institutional church, did not use the cross as their symbol. They used the fish, the dove, the serpent, images representing fluidity, transcendence, and wisdom rather than fixation, suffering, and death. Because they understood that symbols program consciousness, that what you focus on, you amplify, that a religion obsessed with the torture of its founder is a religion that will produce worshippers obsessed with their own suffering, convinced that pain is redemptive, that sacrifice is holy, that denying the body and punishing the flesh is the path to spiritual advancement, when actually these beliefs serve the Archonic agenda perfectly by keeping humans in low-vibration states of guilt, shame, and self-negation, generating exactly the emotional frequencies that lower-dimensional entities feed on most efficiently. And the cross, displayed in millions of churches, worn by billions of believers, erected on hilltops and embedded in flags and stamped on graves, is the most successful symbol of Archonic control ever deployed, a planetary-scale sigil that broadcasts the message, "You are a body, you will suffer, you will die, and your only hope is to beg for salvation from external authority, to accept the narrative of your own sinfulness, to believe you were born broken and can only be fixed by submitting to the hierarchy, the institution, the priesthood, the mediators who stand between you and God, when the terrifying truth that the cross obscures is that there is no mediator, there is no separation. You are not broken, you were never separate from Source, and the only thing keeping you from recognizing your own divine nature is your acceptance of symbols that tell you otherwise, that program your subconscious with messages of limitation, unworthiness, and dependence on external salvation. Comment, "I reject false symbols," and feel the liberation that comes from withdrawing your energy from images that have been weaponized against your consciousness, because the Archonic system cannot force you to accept these symbols, cannot make you participate in their energetic contracts, cannot bind your awareness to their geometries without your consent, and that consent is usually given unconsciously through repetition, through cultural conditioning, through unexamined acceptance of the visual language that surrounds you from birth. But the moment you consciously examine these symbols, the moment you understand what they actually mean and what they're actually doing to your consciousness, you gain the power to refuse them, to neutralize them, to see through them. And once you develop this capacity, you become extremely difficult for the control system to manage, because you're no longer unconsciously absorbing the programming, no longer passively accepting the energetic contracts, no longer feeding your attention and emotion into sigils designed to keep you locked in low-frequency states that serve Archonic appetites rather than your own liberation, your own awakening, your own recognition of the divine sovereignty that has always been your birthright, your nature, your truth, regardless of what symbols tell you, regardless of what authorities claim, regardless of what ancient control systems broadcast into collective consciousness, hoping you'll never learn to decode their messages and recognize them for what they are. Desperate attempts by entities who feed on human energy to keep their food source compliant, confused, and convinced that imprisonment is actually protection, that surveillance is actually care. That limitation is actually the structure of reality itself, rather than just one option among infinite possibilities that consciousness can explore. The fourth symbol that saturates human consciousness and carries devastating Archonic programming is the cube. And this is where the manipulation becomes so sophisticated that most people never recognize it, because the cube appears benign, mathematical, even sacred across multiple religious traditions. But when you understand what the Gnostics knew about geometric forms and their relationship to consciousness, you realize that the cube is perhaps the most insidious trap in the entire symbolic arsenal, because it represents three-dimensional material reality itself, the prison of space-time that the demiurge constructed to contain divine sparks. And every major religion on earth incorporates cube worship into its most sacred practices, from the Kaaba in Mecca that Muslims circumambulate 7 times, to the tefillin cube that observant Jews bind to their foreheads during prayer, to the black cube that appears in occult symbolism, corporate logos, and modern art installations, always the same shape, always the same message, transmitted directly to your subconscious. You exist within boundaries. You are contained within limits. You are defined by edges and corners and faces that separate inside from outside, self from other, freedom from constraint. Comment, I break the cube, and recognize that this statement is not metaphorical but literal, that the cube is a geometric representation of the material matrix, the 3-dimensional prison that appears solid and unchangeable, but is actually a construction of consciousness, a temporary structure that divine awareness created in order to have experiences of limitation, separation, and the journey from forgetting back to remembrance. And the Archons who rule this realm have convinced humanity that the cube is ultimate reality, that 3 dimensions are all that exist, that the material world defined by length, width, and height is the totality of existence, when actually the cube is just one frequency band in an infinite spectrum of dimensional realities, and consciousness that remembers its true nature can step outside the cube anytime it chooses, can access dimensions that exist beyond and before and underlying the 3-dimensional trap, can recognize that the edges defining your experience are not walls imposed by cosmic law, but preferences you selected before incarnation. And those preferences can be changed, those boundaries can be transcended, those limitations can be dissolved the moment you withdraw your agreement to be contained by geometry that serves the demiurge's agenda rather than your own evolution. The cube appears in Saturn symbolism throughout esoteric traditions, and this connection is not accidental, because Saturn is the planetary Archon who rules time, limitation, structure, and the outermost boundary of the 7 heavens, the final gatekeeper before consciousness can escape into the 8th dimension and beyond. And the cube is Saturn's geometric signature, his energetic seal, his binding device that he's embedded into every major religion to ensure that worshippers are unconsciously pledging allegiance not to source consciousness, but to the Archon of limitation himself. And when you see Muslims walking in circles around a black cube, when you see Jews binding a black cube to their third eye during prayer, when you see corporate headquarters designed as perfect cubes, when you see black cube art installations in major cities, you're witnessing Saturn worship. You're seeing the veneration of limitation. You're observing humanity's Stockholm Syndrome relationship with its jailer, loving the prison, decorating the cell, making the cage sacred, never questioning why the most holy object in their tradition is a geometric form that represents enclosure, containment, and the reduction of infinite consciousness to finite coordinates in space-time. The rabbit hole goes deeper when you realize that the English word cube relates to the Greek kaibos, meaning dice, and dice are instruments of chance, of fate, of fortune, determined by forces beyond your control. Another layer of programming suggesting that your life is governed by random events, by luck, by external circumstances, rather than by the creative power of consciousness itself. And every time you see a cube, every time you interact with cubic architecture, every time you unconsciously accept the cube as a neutral shape rather than recognizing it as an archonic binding symbol, you're reinforcing the belief that you are subject to material reality rather than understanding that material reality is subject to you, is responsive to you, is actually constructed by the observing consciousness that you are, which means the prison only exists because you believe it exists. The cube only contains you because you accept its containment, and the moment you see through the symbol, the moment you recognize what it represents and withdraw your energetic agreement with its message, the entire structure of limitation begins to lose its power over your awareness. The fifth symbol is the spiral, and unlike the previous symbols which are overtly archonic, the spiral carries dual potential because it can represent either the descending path into matter or the ascending path back to source. And the Archons have worked tirelessly to ensure that humanity interprets spirals as descent, as the downward journey into increasing density, into the narrowing focus that leads consciousness away from the infinite and toward the singular point of individual incarnation. And you see this in the way spirals appear in hypnosis imagery, in mind control symbolism, in logos for organizations that want to capture your attention and lead it inward toward their message, their product, their agenda. The spiral pulling your focus into a vortex that narrows perception, limits awareness, and ultimately leads to the center point where you are most controlled, most contained, most separated from the peripheral vision that would allow you to see the bigger picture, the wider context, the truth that exists beyond the focal point where the spiral terminates. The Fibonacci spiral that appears throughout nature, that shows up in galaxies and seashells and DNA and pine cones, is beautiful, is mathematical, is undeniably present in organic forms. But the question the Gnostics asked is, does its presence in nature prove that nature is divine, or does it prove that nature is the demiurge's creation, a constructed reality that follows mathematical laws because it was designed, engineered, architected by an intelligence that uses geometry to create stable forms in which to trap consciousness, and the very fact that nature follows predictable patterns, that physics has laws, that reality behaves consistently according to rules that can be discovered and exploited. This is evidence not of divine order, but of cosmic programming, a simulation running on code that the demiurge wrote, a matrix operating according to parameters he established, and the spiral is one of those parameters, one of those subroutines, one of those geometric algorithms that ensures organic forms develop in predictable ways, that growth follows predetermined pathways, that expansion occurs within acceptable limits, that even when consciousness tries to evolve, even when awareness attempts to expand, even when spirit seeks to transcend, it does so along the spiral pathway that ultimately leads back to the center, back to the point, back to the singular incarnated identity that the archonic system needs you to maintain. But here's the key that the Archons fear you'll discover. Spirals can be traversed in either direction. The same geometric form that leads consciousness down into matter can be followed upward out of matter. The descending path is also the ascending path. You just have to turn around, just have to reverse direction, just have to stop following the spiral inward toward increasing limitation and start following it outward toward increasing expansion. And this is what spiritual awakening actually is. Not the acquisition of new knowledge, but the reversal of attention. Not the discovery of hidden truths, but the remembering of obvious truths that were temporarily forgotten. Not the climbing of some difficult mountain, but the simple turning around and walking back the way you came, following the same spiral that brought you into incarnation, but now traveling it in the opposite direction, moving from singular back to plural, from individual back to universal, from form back to formlessness, from the illusion of separation back to the reality of unity. And every authentic spiritual practice, every genuine meditation technique, every real gnosis transmission is actually teaching you how to reverse the spiral, how to unwind the descending path, how to trace your way back through the dimensions you traversed on your way into matter, back through the seven heavens, back past the planetary archons, back beyond the demiurge's domain, back to the pleroma, back to source, back to the infinite consciousness that you never actually left, because you can't leave what you are. You can only forget what you are temporarily. And the spiral symbolizes that forgetting and that remembering, that descent and that ascent, that journey out and that journey back. And the only question is which direction you're traveling, which way you're facing, whether you're still spiraling down into increasing density or whether you've turned around and begun the journey home. The sixth symbol that operates at the deepest level of archonic control is the word itself, language, the entire structure of verbal and written communication that seems like a neutral tool for expressing ideas but is actually a binding spell. A reality generation device that creates the world you experience through the act of naming, defining, and categorizing. Because before language, there is only pure awareness, only direct experience, only the undifferentiated consciousness that precedes all form. But the moment you apply a word to experience, the moment you name what you're perceiving, you collapse the infinite potential of that moment into a singular defined thing. You reduce the mystery to the known. You convert the living reality into a dead category. And this is what the biblical story of Adam naming the animals actually represents. The beginning of the fall, the moment when consciousness trapped itself in language. When awareness started believing that the word is the thing, that the map is the territory, that the description is the reality, and from that moment forward, humanity has been trapped in a linguistic matrix, a prison made of words, a reality tunnel constructed from language that seems like it's describing the world, but is actually creating the world, generating the experience you call reality through the continuous internal narration that most people mistake for their own thoughts, but is actually the voice of the archonic system speaking through your consciousness, programming your perception, limiting your experience to what language can describe, what words can capture, what definitions can contain. The Gnostics knew this, which is why their most advanced teachings were transmitted in silence, in direct transmission from consciousness to consciousness without the mediating filter of language, and why they used paradox, contradiction, and negation in their texts, saying what truth is not, because saying what it is would trap it in language, would reduce it to a definition, would convert living gnosis into dead belief. And the archonic system has worked for millennia to ensure that humanity remains trapped in language, trapped in description, trapped in the word-based reality that can be controlled through media, through education, through religious texts, through legal documents, through all the linguistic structures that govern your life and tell you what things mean, what experiences are, what you should think about what you perceive. And the liberation that the Archons fear most is the liberation into silence, into direct knowing that precedes words, into the wordless awareness that exists before you name your experience, and thereby limit it to the confines of linguistic categories that were designed not by you, but by the control system that needs you to interpret reality through its approved vocabulary, its sanctioned definitions, its authorized meanings. Comment: I reclaim wordless knowing and understand that this is not a rejection of language, but a recognition that language is a tool you use rather than a prison you inhabit, that words serve consciousness rather than consciousness serving words, that you can speak and write and communicate while maintaining awareness that the reality you're describing exists prior to and beyond all descriptions, that the truth you're pointing toward cannot be captured in language, but can be indicated through language for those who have ears to hear beyond the words, eyes to see beyond the symbols, consciousness to know beyond the knowing that language provides. And when you establish yourself in this wordless awareness, when you learn to rest in the silence underneath all speech, when you discover the gap between thoughts, where pure consciousness dwells before it gets clothed in language, and filtered through the linguistic matrix that the archonic system uses to control perception, you become ungovernable through words. You become immune to propaganda. You become impossible to program through media because you're no longer believing the words, no longer accepting the definitions, no longer allowing language to tell you what reality is, and instead, You're using language as a temporary convenience while remaining anchored in the direct perception that knows without needing to be told, that sees without needing to be shown, that understands without needing explanation, because it is understanding itself, it is awareness itself, it is consciousness itself, recognizing its own nature, without requiring the mediation of symbols, definitions, or the entire linguistic control system that humanity has mistaken for neutral communication, when it's actually the primary mechanism through which the demiurge programs reality and ensures that divine sparks remain trapped in a word-based prison, interpreting their infinite nature through the limited vocabulary of material existence, never discovering that silence is not the absence of communication, but the presence of direct knowing, that wordlessness is not emptiness, but fullness, that the reality beyond language is not nothing but everything, not void, but pleroma, not absence, but the infinite presence that precedes all symbols and remains after all symbols dissolve.